My name is Vanessa Cole. I'm 34 years old, and I spend my days finding the lies hidden inside other people's numbers. I'm a forensic accountant. Companies hire me when something doesn't add up, when a set of books looks clean on the surface but feels wrong underneath, the way a floor feels wrong right before it gives out. I found my parents' books the same way, except this time, the fraud wasn't in a spreadsheet. It was in my own family. And on a Sunday afternoon in August, sitting at my parents' dining table with a pen in my hand and a document in front of me, my own mother looked me dead in the eye and said the sentence that ended 29 years of being the good daughter. Sign this, or you're dead to us. I want you to sit with that sentence for a second, because I did. I sat with it for what felt like an hour, though the clock on the wall said it was only for seconds. Behind my mother stood my father, arms crossed, jaw tight, a man who hadn't looked me in the eye all afternoon. Beside her sat my younger sister, Chloe, mascara already smudged, holding her fianki's hand like it was the only solid thing left in the room. And on the table between us sat a single sheet of paper, printed, notarized, waiting for a signature that would cost me $45,000 I hadn't agreed to spend. But to understand how a Sunday dinner turned into an ultimatum, you have to go back 5 months, to a phone call I almost didn't answer. It was March, a Tuesday, and I was knee-deep in a case involving a mid-sized logistics company that had been quietly bleeding money through a vendor account nobody questioned because the owner's brother-in-law ran it. That's the thing about fraud. It almost never comes from a stranger. It comes from someone who's already inside the house, someone everyone trusts too much to check. I didn't know yet that I was about to learn that lesson at my own kitchen table. My phone rang during a meeting, and I saw my mother's name light up the screen. She never called during the day. She texted, she left voicemails for special occasions, but she didn't call. So I stepped out into the hallway, and before I even said hello, she was already talking, fast and bright, the voice she uses when she's decided something is exciting and needs me to agree before I've had time to think. Chloe's engaged, she said. Ryan proposed this weekend at the lake house. Isn't that wonderful, Vanessa? I said it was wonderful, because it was, or at least I thought it was. My sister is 26, sweet in the way people are sweet when nobody has ever asked them to carry real weight, and she'd been dating Ryan Bennett for a little over a year. I'd met him twice in a year, which should have told me something, but I was busy, and I trusted my sister's judgment the way you trust a smoke detector you've never actually tested. The wedding planning started almost immediately, and it started loud. My mother has always measured love in receipts. Growing up, if you wanted to know how much someone mattered in our house, you didn't listen to what was said at dinner, you watched what got paid for without complaint. My father worked overtime for years to keep up appearances my mother insisted on, the kind of appearances that convince the neighbors you're doing better than you are. I learned early that being the responsible one meant being the one who didn't ask for things, and eventually it meant being the one who paid for things instead. I put myself through college on scholarships and 2 jobs because I didn't want to be one more invoice on my father's overtime sheet. Chloe, on the other hand, was the baby, the miracle after 2 miscarriages my mother still brings up at holidays, and Chloe never learned to read a price tag as a warning label. So when the venue quote came in at $19,000, and the photographer at another $6,000, and the dress at a number that made me actually laugh out loud on a phone call, I assumed, foolishly, that my parents had a plan. They did have a plan. The plan was me. The invoice arrived in May, though at the time nobody called it that. My mother called it a family meeting. She invited me to Sunday dinner, which wasn't unusual, except she asked me to come alone, without my boyfriend Marcus, which was unusual, because Marcus had been coming to Sunday dinners for 2 years and my mother adored him more than she sometimes seemed to adore me. I should have clocked that detail. In my job, when a client suddenly wants to meet you privately, without their lawyer, without their partner, without anyone who might ask a hard question on their behalf, it means they're about to ask you for something they don't want witnessed. I walked into that dinner thinking we'd talk about seating charts. Instead, my mother slid a folded piece of paper across the table before the appetizers were even served and said, "This is just so everyone's on the same page moving forward." On that paper was a full wedding budget breakdown, $71,000 total, and beside the word family contribution, a single figure circled in blue ink. $45,000. My name was written next to it, not as a question, not as a request, just as a fact that had already been decided somewhere I wasn't invited to. I remember laughing, actually laughing, because I thought it had to be a joke, the kind of joke my mother makes when she wants to gauge a reaction before committing to something serious. But nobody else at the table laughed. My father kept eating. Chloe stared at her plate like it owed her an apology, and my mother just watched me with the calm, patient expression of a woman who has already decided how this conversation ends and is simply waiting for me to catch up to her. I asked her flatly where she thought I had $45,000 sitting around waiting to be spent on a wedding I hadn't budgeted for, hadn't been asked about, and frankly hadn't even fully agreed made financial sense for a couple who'd been together barely over a year. And that's when my mother said the first version of the sentence I'd hear again in August, softer this time, but with the same bones underneath it. Family helps family, Vanessa. That's not a big ask. It's what we do for each other. Except it wasn't what we did for each other. It was what I did for everyone else, and had done quietly for over a decade, without anyone ever once offering to return the favor. I didn't sign anything that night. I told them I needed time to think, which in my family is apparently the same as declaring war, because within 72 hours, my mother had stopped answering my texts. My father sent one clipped message that just said, "We're disappointed in you," and my sister posted a photo online with the caption "Real family shows up," tagging no one, but somehow everyone at that table knew exactly who it was aimed at. What none of them knew yet, sitting in that dining room congratulating themselves on cornering me, was that forensic accountants don't get uncomfortable when someone hands them a number that doesn't make sense. We get curious. And curiosity, in my line of work, has a way of digging up things people spent a lot of effort trying to bury. Because somewhere between that first dinner and the one in August, I stopped asking why my family suddenly needed $45,000 from me specifically, and started asking a much more dangerous question. Why did they need it so badly, and so fast, that they were willing to threaten to erase me from the family to get it? I didn't confront my family again right away. In my line of work, you never walk back into a negotiation until you understand exactly what you're negotiating against, and right then, I didn't understand anything. I only had a feeling, the same feeling I get 3 pages into an audit when a number is technically correct but somehow still wrong. So instead of calling my mother, I called the one person who always tells me the truth even when it costs him something. My cousin Derek works construction with my father, and he's the closest thing I have to a source inside my parents' world. I asked him carefully if he'd noticed anything strange about my dad lately, money trouble, stress, anything. Derek went quiet for a second too long, and in my job, silence like that is a red flag with a name on it. Then he said something that changed the entire shape of this story. "Your dad asked me for a loan last month, Vanessa, $5,000, said it was temporary. I want you to sit with that, because I did." My father, a man who had worked overtime for 30 years, who prided himself on never owing anyone anything, had quietly asked a nephew for $5,000 while simultaneously demanding $45,000 from me for a wedding. That's not a family helping family. That's a household in freefall, dressing itself up as a celebration. I did what I always do when the story someone's telling me doesn't match the numbers. I started pulling records, not out of spite, but out of the same instinct that's paid my bills for a decade. Public records first, because they're free and they don't lie the way people do. My parents' house, the one I grew up in, the one my mother still calls the family home like it's a sacred inheritance, had a second mortgage filed against it in February, 4 months before Chloe even got engaged. $62,000 pulled out in equity. I sat in my car in a parking garage staring at that filing on my phone for a long time because it meant one simple, ugly thing. Whatever was happening in my parents' finances didn't start with the wedding. The wedding was the excuse. The debt came first. I kept going, the way you always keep going once you've found the first thread. Because the first thread is never the only one. My father's small side business, the handyman work he'd done for extra cash since I was a kid, had a business license that lapsed 8 months ago and was never renewed. A man who bragged about that license at every barbecue for 15 years had let it die quietly and told nobody. And when I checked my mother's name against a basic online search, the kind any of us could run in 30 seconds, I found something that made my stomach drop straight through the floor of that parking garage. A civil judgment, $11,000, filed against her by a former employer for what the court documents vaguely called unauthorized use of company funds. My mother had told everyone at Thanksgiving 2 years ago that she left that job to spend more time with family. She hadn't left. She'd been let go, quietly, with a settlement that came with silence built into it, and apparently the silence had a hole in it big enough to swallow $11,000. I sat in that parking garage for almost 40 minutes doing what I do for a living, except this time the company under investigation raised me. I built a simple timeline the way I would for any client, dates on the left, dollar amounts on the right, and when I stepped back and looked at the whole thing laid out, the picture wasn't a wedding at all. It was a household quietly drowning for over a year, borrowing from a nephew, borrowing against a house, sitting on an unpaid legal judgment. And somewhere in the middle of all that financial water rising around them, deciding the fastest lifeboat available was their older daughter's savings account. $45,000 wasn't a gift to Chloe. It was a bailout wearing a wedding dress. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it, which meant I couldn't sit across a table from my mother and pretend I still believed the story she was selling. I called Marcus that night and laid the whole thing out on our kitchen counter the way I would for a client, receipts and filings spread out like evidence because that's exactly what they were. Marcus is an attorney, contracts mostly, careful by nature, the kind of man who reads everything twice before he says a word out loud. He went quiet for a long time looking at the second mortgage filing, then he asked me the question that reframed everything. Vanessa, does your family know I do litigation on the side? I told him no, they barely asked him anything beyond housework, the same shallow curiosity they'd shown my entire career. Marcus set the papers down very carefully and said, then they have no idea what's about to be sitting at their table. For the first time since that dinner in May, I felt something other than hurt. I felt prepared, but preparation didn't stop the pressure campaign, and if anything, it got worse the quieter I got. My mother started a group chat titled Chloe's Big Day, added every aunt, every cousin, every family friend who'd ever held one of us as a baby, and left me out of it entirely, which of course meant everyone in that chat knew exactly why I wasn't included before I'd said a single word in my own defense. My Aunt Rita called me directly, syrup in her voice, saying she just wanted to check on me, before pivoting straight into how sacrifices are what family is about, and didn't I remember everything my parents did for me growing up? I wanted to ask her which specific sacrifice she meant, the overtime shifts my father never once mentioned to me until this year, or the mortgage they took out in secret for months before anyone got engaged. But I stayed quiet, because in my job you never show your full hand to someone who's just there to report back to the person who sent them. Chloe texted me exactly once during those weeks, and it wasn't kind. Mom says you're choosing money over your own sister. I stared at that message for a long time before I typed back a single question that I never got an answer to. Chloe, did you know Dad borrowed $5,000 from Derek last month? The 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then nothing. Silence again, the same silence Derek had given me on the phone, and by now I knew exactly what that silence meant. By the end of June, I had a folder of my own printed, organized, tabbed the way I organize every case that ends up meaning something. Inside it sat the second mortgage filing, the lapsed business license, the civil judgment against my mother, and a running timeline that connected every quiet financial collapse in my parents' life directly to the exact month they suddenly needed $45,000 from their oldest daughter. I hadn't shown it to anyone in my family yet. I was waiting, the way you wait when you know the other side hasn't finished playing their hand. Because I had a feeling, the same feeling that's never once been wrong in 10 years of this job, that the invoice in May wasn't the final ask. It was the opening offer. And 3 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon that started with my mother's voice sounding warmer than it had in months, I found out exactly how far my family was willing to go to collect. She called and said 4 words that should have felt like an olive branch, but instead sent a cold, specific kind of dread straight through my chest. Come home this Sunday, alone. I almost didn't go. I want to be honest about that, because it matters. Every instinct built from 10 years of reading people who lie for a living was telling me that walking into that house alone was a mistake. The same kind of mistake I warn clients against every day. Never negotiate on their turf without your own paperwork in hand. But I'm also my mother's daughter in one specific way, whether I like it or not. I don't leave a question unanswered once I know there's an answer to find. So that Sunday morning, I did what I always do before walking into a meeting that matters. I prepared. I printed a second copy of the folder, the one with the mortgage filing, the lapse license, the judgment against my mother, and I put it in my bag along with something else. Something I'd been sitting on for 2 weeks without telling a single person, not even Marcus. A voicemail. My father, 3 days after Derek told me about the loan, had but dialed me while talking to someone on speaker in his truck, and for 40 seconds, before the call disconnected, I heard him say something he never meant for me to hear. We just need Vanessa to sign it, he said. Once the venue's paid, we can roll the mortgage payment into the same account and nobody has to know how bad it got. I'd listened to that recording 11 times by the time Sunday came. 11 times, memorizing every word, because in my job, you don't get evidence like that twice, and you never, ever go into a meeting without knowing exactly what the other side doesn't know you already have. Marcus wanted to come. He stood in our kitchen with his keys already in his hand, telling me he could wait in the car, that he wouldn't say a word unless I needed him to, but I told him no, not yet. I needed my parents to say the quiet part out loud first, on their own, without a lawyer's presence changing what they were willing to admit. So I drove to that house alone, the same house I grew up in, the porch light on even though it was still daylight, which struck me as strange the second I pulled into the driveway, because my mother only turns that light on for people she's trying to impress. I hadn't been a guest in my own childhood home in 29 years. I was one now. My mother opened the door before I even knocked, wearing the kind of warm, rehearsed smile I recognized instantly from every fraud case I've ever worked, the smile of someone who has already decided how the meeting ends and is simply performing the version of themselves that gets them there. Vanessa, sweetheart, come in, we've missed you. Inside, the table was already set, for places, my father at the head, Chloe beside him looking smaller than I'd ever seen her, and beside Chloe, a chair I hadn't expected. Ryan, my sister's fiancé, sitting at my parents' table on a Sunday I'd been specifically told to come to alone, and the second I saw him there, every alarm I had went off at once, because in my line of work, when the person you were told wouldn't be present shows up anyway, it means the meeting was never about a conversation. It was about numbers. And where there are numbers, in my experience, there's usually someone in the room whose interests don't actually line up with the family's at all. We made it exactly through the salad course before my mother reached under her chair and pulled out a manila envelope, sliding it across the table with the same practice calm she'd used in May, except this time there was no folded, half-apologetic budget sheet inside. This time it was a full document, printed on heavier paper, with a line at the bottom for a notary stamp that was conspicuously still empty. My father wouldn't look at me. Chloe stared at her lap, and Ryan, for the first time since I'd walked in, spoke directly to me, smooth, rehearsed, the kind of tone people use when they've practiced a pitch in a mirror. "Vanessa, this just protects everyone," he said. "It's not really about the money. It's about making sure the family's on solid ground moving forward." I asked him, flatly, what exactly solid ground meant in a legal document with my name already typed in as the responsible party, and that's when my mother jumped in before he could answer, her voice sharpening the way it always does when a plan starts slipping off script. "It's simple, Vanessa. You sign, you cover the wedding costs like we discussed, and everything goes back to normal." We stopped having this conversation. Except we had never actually had this conversation. I had never agreed to anything in May. I had asked for time to think, and in the 5 months since, nobody had once asked me what I decided. They'd simply built a document assuming the answer was yes, and brought a notary line to make it permanent. I picked up the papers and started reading slowly, the way I read every document someone hopes I'll sign without reading closely, and about halfway down the second page, I found something that stopped me completely. This wasn't just a wedding contribution agreement. Buried in paragraph 4, in language dense enough that most people would skim right past it, was a clause listing me as a co-signer on a separate line of credit, one connected not to a venue or a caterer, but to an account under a business name I didn't recognize. Bennett Home Solutions. I looked up at Ryan, and for the first time all evening, his easy, rehearsed smile faltered, just slightly, just long enough for me to see it. I asked him directly what Bennett Home Solutions was, and my mother answered before he could, too fast, too eager. "It's Ryan's new venture, sweetheart. We're all investing as a family. Isn't that exciting?" I sat there holding a legal document that would have made me personally liable for debt tied to a business I'd never heard of, run by a man I'd met exactly twice, and I finally understood something that turned my stomach cold. This was never about a wedding at all. The wedding was the emotional cover story. What they actually needed from me was my credit, my income, my name on paper, to prop up something Ryan Bennett had built and was apparently already struggling to keep standing. I set the document down very carefully on the table, the same way I set down evidence in every case that's about to break wide open, and I asked one simple question into a room that had gone completely silent. "Does anyone here actually know what Ryan does for a living? Or has everyone just been trusting the way he talks about it?" Nobody answered. My father finally looked up from his plate, and for just a second, I saw something in his face that looked almost like fear, not of me, but of what I might already know. My mother's smile stayed fixed in place, but her hands, folded on the table in front of her, had gone white at the knuckles. And Chloe, my sweet, trusting sister, turned to look at her fiancé with an expression I will never forget as long as I live, the exact look of someone realizing in real time, in front of her entire family, that she might not actually know the man she was about to marry at all. That's when my mother's voice dropped low, low and hard in a way I'd never heard directed at me before, stripped of every ounce of warmth she'd walked in wearing. She reached across the table, placed her hand flat on top of the document, and said the sentence I will remember for the rest of my life, the sentence that turned a family dinner into something closer to a hostage negotiation. "Sign it tonight, Vanessa, or don't bother coming back here again. You'll be dead to this family." I looked at my father, waiting, hoping for him to say something, anything, to push back against the woman he'd been married to for 31 years. He didn't say a single word, and in that silence, sitting at the table I'd eaten dinner at my entire childhood, I understood that the folder sitting in my bag, the mortgage filing, the judgment, the voicemail I'd listened to 11 times, wasn't just evidence anymore. It was about to become the only thing standing between me and whatever my family was really trying to build on the back of my name. So I reached down, unzipped my bag, and asked my mother one final question before I pulled out a single sheet of paper that was about to change everything sitting on that table. "Before I sign anything, don't you want to know what I already found?" The room went completely still. Even the sound of forks against plates stopped, because everyone at that table understood, in the way you understand weather changing before the first drop falls, that whatever I was about to pull out of that bag was going to matter more than anything printed on the document sitting under my mother's white-knuckled hand. I laid the folder down slowly, the way I lay evidence in front of a client who still thinks their books are clean, and I opened it page by page, letting the silence do half the work for me. First, the second mortgage filing, $62,000 pulled against the house for months before Chloe was even engaged. My mother's face didn't move, but her hand slid off the document in front of her, just an inch, just enough to tell me she hadn't expected this particular page to exist outside a courthouse basement. Next, the lapsed business license, my father's handyman work, the license he'd bragged about for 15 years, quietly expired and never renewed. My father finally looked up, and for the first time all night, he looked directly at me instead of his plate, and what was on his face wasn't anger. It was something closer to relief, the exhausted relief of a man who has been carrying a secret so long that even having it exposed feels lighter than the silence did. Then I placed the civil judgment on the table, $11,000, my mother's name typed clearly at the top, filed by a former employer for unauthorized use of company funds. I watched her read it upside down from across the table, and I watched the exact moment her composure cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, just a small tightening around her eyes, the look of someone realizing the story they'd told at every holiday for 2 years had just been quietly disproven in front of her own children. Chloe reached for the page before her mother could stop her, and she read it twice, her lips moving slightly, and when she finally looked up, she wasn't looking at me anymore. She was looking at our mother. "You told everyone you left that job," Chloe said, and it wasn't a question, it was an accusation, the first one my sister had ever made against our mother in her entire life. My mother opened her mouth to explain, and nothing came out, because there was no version of that explanation that didn't confirm exactly what the paper already said. I saved the last two pieces for exactly this moment, because in my job, timing is everything, and you never show your strongest evidence until the room has already started doubting the story it walked in believing. I placed my phone on the table, screen up, and pressed play on the voicemail, my father's own voice filling that dining room for the second time in his life, except this time he had to hear it alongside everyone he'd been trying to protect from hearing it at all. "We just need Vanessa to sign it. Once the venue's paid, we can roll the mortgage payment into the same account and nobody has to know how bad it got." 40 seconds of my father's voice, calm, practical, planning to fold his own hidden debt into a wedding invoice under my name, and when it ended, nobody at that table breathed for a long moment. My father set down his fork very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have started shaking and you don't want anyone to notice. "I know how that sounds, Vanessa," he said quietly, and it was the first true sentence anyone had spoken to me since I'd walked through that door. Then I turned to Ryan, and I placed the final page in front of him, a printout I'd pulled 2 nights earlier from the state's business registry, Bennett Home Solutions LLC, formed 11 months ago, and beneath it, a second filing I'd found almost by accident while searching adjacent records. A small claims judgment from a supplier in a neighboring county, $4,200, entered against Ryan personally after he stopped responding to their invoices. I asked him the same question I'd asked 10 minutes earlier, except this time I already knew the answer before he said a word. So the line of credit I was being asked to co-sign wasn't for a wedding at all, was it? It was to keep your business from collapsing before you even got your first full year of operating. Ryan's rehearsed smile was completely gone now, and what replaced it was the flat, calculating look of a man doing quick math on how much damage control was still possible in a room where every exit had just quietly closed. He started to say something about cash flow being complicated for any new business, and Chloe, my sister, who hadn't said a real word all evening, stood up out of her chair so fast it scraped hard against the floor. "You told me you'd already gotten your first client signed," she said, her voice cracking down the middle. "You told me things were going great. Were you ever going to tell me any of this? Or was I just supposed to find out after I married you?" Nobody answered her, because there was no answer that wasn't an admission, and in the silence that followed, my mother made one final attempt to hold the room together the only way she knew how, by reaching for the ledger she'd been keeping on all of us our entire lives. "Vanessa," she said, her voice lower now, stripped of the performance, "this is exactly why we need to handle this as a family, quietly, before it gets any worse. Sign the wedding contribution, forget the business line, we'll figure that part out separately, and none of this has to leave this room." I looked at her for a long moment, at the woman who had raised me to believe love was something you proved through what you were willing to pay, and I felt something settle in my chest that was calmer than anger, steadier than hurt. "I'm not signing anything, Mom," I said. "Not the wedding agreement, not the business line, not tonight, not ever. And I'm not doing it to punish anyone at this table. I'm doing it because I finally understand that I was never actually being asked to help fund a wedding. I was being asked to quietly absorb 3 different people's financial collapse and call it love." My mother's face hardened back into the version I'd walked into, the toll booth version, the one that had delivered the ultimatum an hour earlier. "Then I suppose you already know what that means," she said. "You're choosing to walk away from this family over money." I stood up, gathered the folder, and looked at her directly, because I wanted her to hear this part clearly, without a document between us. "I'm not choosing money over family, Mom. I'm choosing honesty over a family that only wanted me at this table because of what I could pay for. You didn't invite me to dinner tonight. You invited a co-signer." My father walked me to the door, the first time he'd stood up from that table all night, and in the doorway, quietly, where no one else could hear, he said the only thing that felt real all evening. "I'm sorry, Vanessa. I should have told you myself a long time ago." I told him I knew, and that it wasn't too late for him to start telling the truth now, to Chloe, to my mother, to himself. He didn't answer, but he hugged me for the first time in longer than I could remember, and it felt like the first honest thing that had happened in that house all night. In the weeks that followed, the wedding was quietly called off, not by me, but by Chloe, once she'd had time to look into Ryan's finances herself and found far more than what I'd already uncovered. My father slowly started being honest about the mortgage, and the 2 of them began working with a credit counselor instead of another invoice with my name on it. My mother still hasn't fully forgiven me for that night, and some days I'm not sure she ever will, because forgiving me would mean admitting the ledger she'd kept on me my whole life was never really about love to begin with. But Chloe calls me now, regularly, no longer through a group chat that excludes me, just her, honest, asking real questions instead of reciting a script someone else handed her. I spend my days finding the lies hidden inside other people's numbers, and it took my own family, at my own dinner table, to teach me the one lesson no audit ever fully prepared me for. Love that only shows up with an invoice attached was never love in the first place. It was a debt, dressed up in a family's best china, and I was done being the only one expected to pay it.